Hello, this is for ISOL 633 with the University of the Cumberlands. Textbook is Legal Issues in Information Security. And this is Chapter 14, Risk Analysis, Incident Response, and Contingency Planning. Risk management is an important information security tool. The risk management process helps an organization understand the risks, vulnerabilities, and threats that it faces each day. It helps the organization understand its security posture. Also helps the organization know where to strengthen that posture. An organization can't meet its information security goals if it doesn't understand its risks. It may not be able to properly protect its resources and data. This chapter focuses on information technology risk management, reviews fundamental risk concepts and how they're applied. It explains how organizations use risk management to help them create their other contingency plans. So the learning objective for this chapter is to explain the importance of risk management and contingency planning. Things we'll cover in the chapter include how to plan for contingencies, what risk management is, what three types of contingency planning are, what incident response is, and what some special considerations are. The key concepts we'll look at would be risk analysis, again, incident response procedures, disaster recovery plans, contingency planning, and business continuity planning. Organizations must plan for many events. Contingency plans don't focus just on an organization's information security assets. Instead, the field has grown to include all types of planning to make sure that an organization can continue to operate in the event of an emergency or disaster. In recent years, the United States has seen several dramatic events that highlighted the need for all types of contingency plans. The September 11 terror attacks in 2001, the northeastern U.S. power grid failure in 2003, Hurricane Katrina in 2005, the H1N1 flu outbreak in 2009. When organizations talk about contingency plans, they're talking about holistic plans. These are plans that cover the whole organization and all of its processes. They identify operations that are critical to the business survival and recovery. These processes include IT resources and operations. Many organizations store their data and records electronically. Many of them have grown dependent on their IT resources and the automated processes those resources provide. Thus, focusing on how to protect and recover IT assets is an important contingency planning component. Some studies indicate that almost half of all companies that experience a data loss never recover. The chapter will focus on contingency planning processes as they relate to IT resources. The three different planning processes discussed include incident response planning, disaster recovery planning, and business continuity planning. The scope of any kind of contingency planning is very broad. The chapter focuses on only one narrow piece, planning for the security of IT resources. While all contingency plans have different goals, the foundation for these processes is the same. In order to prepare contingency plans, organizations must analyze and plan for the IT risks that they face. The risk analysis and foundation processes helps an organization understand how it needs to protect its IT resources. An organization can't make any contingency plan until it understands the risks of it to its IT resources. The National Institute of Standards and Technology says that risk management is a complex, multifaceted activity that requires the involvement of an entire organization. Risk management, or RM, helps an organization identify the risks that it faces. It also makes sure that organizations respond to risk in a cost-effective manner. Organizations use risk management to support their business goals. One of the main goals of risk management is to protect the bottom line. When risk is realized, it negatively affects an organization's profits. Risk management helps an organization align its information security needs to its business goals. Make sure that organizations spend its limited resources wisely in ways that enhance business goals. An organization uses risk management to plan for information security. Each step in the risk management process supports an organization's business goals. The most basic risk management process includes the following steps. Risk assessment, identifying the threats and vulnerabilities to organization's IT resources, and determining the impact of those threats and vulnerabilities. Risk response, use policies and controls to respond to risk. An organization responds to risk according to its business strategy. Employee training. Train employees on known threats and vulnerabilities. Training can help avoid risk. And continuous monitoring. Monitoring the organization's policies and controls for continued effectiveness. Update policies and controls that aren't effective. Risk assessment. Risk assessment identifies the threats and vulnerabilities in IT resources. It reviews the probability of those threats and vulnerabilities actually happening. It's called a realized risk. When the risk assessment reviews the potential harm from realized risk. Finally, the risk assessment identifies policies and controls that could respond to the potential risk. Risk response is the action taken by an organization to reduce realized risk to an acceptable level. The amount of risk that is left over after realized risk is reduced is called residual risk. So risk assessment team. A risk assessment team must include people in a number of different roles throughout an organization. Even though the risk assessment focuses on risk to IT system, it's not sufficient to only include IT personnel on the team. IT personnel may not know about all of the organization's critical business processes. For the same reason, it's not enough to include only business personnel on the risk assessment team. Business personnel may not appreciate the technology processes that support business operations. The risk assessment team members should represent all areas involved in a business process workflow. Risk assessment team members should include business personnel. These people are responsible for business process operations. They know the steps that must be completed in each business process. They also can describe how they use IT systems to accomplish their job duties. IT personnel. These people run the organization's various IT systems. This group also might include IT system owner. These personnel understand how their IT systems work. They're responsible for maintaining those systems. They also would be responsible for implementing any changes to IT systems. Information security managers. These people run the organization's information security program. They have knowledge about information security threats and vulnerabilities. They also know how threats and vulnerabilities can be mitigated. Human resources personnel. These people understand how to deal with people issues. They can offer advice and input on how to address human-based threats and vulnerabilities. They also will be able to assist with awareness training after the risk assessment is completed. and executive management. These people make sure that the risk assessment team has the support and resources it needs to complete the assessment. They can hold business units accountable for participating in the assessment. They can make sure that the risk assessment remains properly scoped to its original goal. The members of the team must be objective. Must be willing to take a hard look at an organization's business objectives and processes for risk potential. They must do the same thing for IT resources. Members of the team must avoid conflicts of interest in the risk assessment context. A conflict of interest is a situation where a member's responsibilities as part of the risk assessment team might conflict with their job responsibilities. And conflict of interest prevents the team members from meeting their risk assessment responsibilities. A vulnerability is a weakness or flaw in an IT system. Information security is compromised when vulnerabilities are exploited. An exploit is a successful attack against a vulnerability. There are many different kinds of vulnerabilities. They all fall into four broad categories. They include people, process, facility, and technology vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities can be design mistakes. They also can be configuration mistakes. Threats are anything that can cause harm to an information system. There are successful exploits against vulnerabilities. A threat source carries out a threat or causes it to take place against a vulnerability. A threat source can be a person or a circumstance. Like vulnerabilities, threats also fall into four broad categories. They are human, natural, technology, and operational, and physical and environmental. Threats can be deliberate or accidental. Quantitative risk analysis. Quantitative risk analysis attempts to use real numbers to calculate risk and potential loss. An organization assigns real numbers to the value of its assets. It also assigns real values to the cost of countermeasures and controls. One of the greatest advantages of a quantitative risk assessment is that it provides an objective assessment of cost. It helps the organization understand both the cost of risk and the cost of controls. This type of a risk assessment allows management to directly compare the cost and benefits of recommended controls. One of the greatest advantages of quantitative risk assessment is that they're very difficult to administer. In the quantitative risk analysis, the risk analysis team must assign a value amount to each of the organization's assets. A number of factors shape the cost of an asset, such as the cost of developing it and when the ongoing cost of maintaining it each year. The asset might have value that is hard to measure. For example, it might be hard to value the intellectual property that goes into creating and developing an asset. It's also hard to place a value on an asset that provides an organization with its competitive edge. While quantitative risk analysis does give an organization actual money amounts for its assets, there's a subjective element to these values that is hard to measure. This is particularly true if an asset has intangible value. Qualitative risk analysis. Qualitative risk analysis uses scenarios and rating systems to calculate risk and potential harm. Qualitative risk analysis doesn't assign money value to assets and risk. Instead, it uses descriptive categories to express asset criticality, risk exposure or likelihood, and risk impact. One of the greatest advantages of this method is that it's relatively easy to use. It doesn't require a risk assessment team members to have specialized financial knowledge. It also doesn't require them to deduce the cost of assets, controls, and potential harm. One of the biggest disadvantages of qualitative risk assessment is that they're very subjective. The opinions of the members of the risk assessment team can influence the results of the risk assessment. Qualitative risk analysis is scenario-based. In this type of assessment, the risk assessment team considers a specific vulnerability or threat. The team then considers a scenario based on it. As team members walk through the scenario, they think about how the scenario will affect business operations and resources. The team members will use their own experiences to determine threat likelihood, and they can also use industry resources. So the risk level matrix. Risk exposure categories classify the likelihood of certain risks. A risk assessment team might use the following categories to determine risk exposure. Low, events that are unlikely to happen within a year, or medium, events that are somewhat likely to happen within a year, and high, events that are likely to happen within a year. Risk impact is determined the same way impact and category classify the harm to an organization if a risk is realized. A risk assessment team might use the following impact categories. So low, a realized risk will have little or no effect on the organization. An organization will experience a light disruption to its business processes. It will occur only low costs related to low productivity and data. It won't experience loss. Medium, realized risk will have a moderate effect on the organization. The organization may experience moderate disruption to its business processes. It will incur moderate costs related to lost productivity and data, and its reputational loss will be moderate. And high, a realized risk will have a severe effect on the organization. The organization may experience severe disruption to its business process. It will experience high costs related to lost productivity and data, and its reputational loss will be significant. Risk assessment team also will need a way to compare likelihood and impact levels to determine overall risk level. The risk assessment team will use the overall risk level to determine where the organization should apply controls. An organization won't want to implement costly controls on a system that has low exposure and impact results. However, it will want to implement controls where there's a high likelihood rating and a high impact rating. It must create a method to analyze the likelihood and impact rating levels. It uses the analysis to determine the priority of issues that the organization must address. Organizations use this risk level matrix to determine the priority of the risks that they must address. This image on the screen shows the results of a quantitative risk analysis might look like. It uses the vulnerabilities and threats. In this example, the risk assessment team will first recommend the organization implement controls to remove user accounts for terminated employees in a timely manner. This is because the risk level for that vulnerability is higher than the others listed in the table. The problem with qualitative risk assessment is that the organization has no way to determine the amount of money to spend on controls. It also has no way of knowing if it's spending too much on a control relative to the actual loss that it could have due to realized risk. For some organizations, this is a significant failure of a qualitative risk analysis. This is one reason why an organization might prefer to complete a quantitative risk analysis. Elements of incident response plan. Once the organization processes its incident response policy, the incident response team can continue to define the incident response plan. The incident response policy contains the overall incident response goals. The incident response plan contains the procedural elements that are necessary to meet these policy goals. Operational Information Security Team will follow the incident response plan to fulfill their incident response job duties. The term incident handler to be used to refer to the organizational teams that respond to an incident. The incident response plan is specific to a particular organization. However, most incident response plans have 5 basic parts. They are incident triage, investigation, containment or mitigation, recovery, and review. The triage phase is the first phase in the incident response process. This is the phase where a potential incident is initially assessed. So at this point, the primary handler will verify whether an adverse event meets the definition of an incident. The primary handler is a person who is in charge of coordinating an organization's response to an information security incident. This person is often a member of the organization's information security team. Investigation is the second phase in the incident response process. During this phase, the incident handlers learn about the incident and its source. They learn more about the impact that the incident is having on the organization. The incident handlers must find all of the resources that are affected by the incident. They also must contact other areas as needed to fully understand the scope of the incident. The incident response policy and plan let the incident handlers know who they must contact. The organization must begin the containment phase almost as soon as the incident is reported. During this step, incident handlers must take steps to limit damage caused by the incident. They use different methods to contain an incident depending upon its nature. For example, if the incident is a self-propagating virus, incident handlers may remove the infected system from the organization's network. If the incident is particularly authoritative-looking phishing email, incident handlers may issue an alert or other notifications to the organization's employees. The alert would tell the employees not to respond to a phishing email. Incident handlers might use a number of different tactics to mitigate an incident. The organization repairs and recovers IT resources and data during the recovery phase. IT resources and data should be repaired in such a way that they're not vulnerable in the same type of incident again. This is called hardening. In addition to hardening damaged IT resources, organizations must harden resources that are similar to the damaged resources. This makes sure that similar resources aren't harmed by similar incidents. After an IT resource is repaired, it should be tested for any additional vulnerabilities or weaknesses before it's put back into production. The recovery and repair method will depend upon the nature of the incident. All stages in the incident response process must be fully documented. The primary incident handler is responsible for making sure that each step in the process has been fully documented. This is important because the incident response planning team can review the notes from the incident handlers to determine whether the incident response plan worked as intended. During the review stage, both the incident handlers and the incident response planning team can review documentation to learn the dollar amount spent in handling the incident, dollar amount spent to prevent similar incidents in the future, loss of staff time in handling the incident, how the response to the current incident compares to similar incidents in the past, recommendations on policy and procedural changes as a result of lessons learned from the incident. The review phase is often overlooked. because it's easy for an organization's employees to go back to their normal operational duties after an incident. The incident response planning team must make sure that the review process is formally required by policy. So business continuity. Business disaster and business continuity plans help an organization respond to a disaster. Disaster is a sudden, unplanned event. Disasters negatively affect the organization's critical business functions for an unknown period. The difference between a disaster and an incident is subtle. A disaster severely affects an organization's infrastructure. It interrupts critical business functions. An incident tends to refer to service failures that affect the confidentiality, integrity, and/or availability of an organization's data and IT systems. An incident may become a disaster in some situations. Examples of disasters include natural threats and deliberate human-made threats. Natural threats are uncontrollable events. They include earthquakes, fires, and floods. Human-made threats include sabotage and terrorist activities. Threats can evolve into a disaster, also include equipment, electrical, and communications infrastructure failure. Disasters aren't predictable. Organizations can't control these types of threats. They can take measures to try to limit the damage caused by these events. Organizations also can make plans to respond to these types of events. Business continuity plans focus on how the organization continues its business during and after a disaster. These plans tend to be more comprehensive. They cover all parts of the business, not just IT systems. These plans address the period between the disaster and return to normal operations. A formal distinction between disaster recovery and business continuity plans is eroding. This is because organizations rely on IT systems for many of their critical functions. Some organizations build their whole business model on their IT systems. Today's most organizations consider disaster recovery and business continuity to be the same thing. You may find the terms used interchangeably. Most references recognize that the business recovery plan must be part of a comprehensive business continuity plan. So business continuity. Many of the steps in the business continuity and disaster recovery plan process are similar to the response analysis and incident response planning process. Contingency planning is part of a risk management. The steps of the disaster recovery and business continuity process are: develop the disaster recovery and business continuity policy, conduct a business impact analysis, identify threats and potential controls, determine recovery strategy, design and maintain the plan. The disaster recovery and business continuity team must make sure the policies and plans are in place to help the organization complete these steps. The disaster recovery and business continuity policy is a statement of the executive management's commitment to the business continuity planning. It should state the purpose and goals of disaster recovery. The policy should define disaster recovery and business continuity roles and responsibilities. Policy should include the organization's resource requirements for any disaster recovery and business continuity plan. So in summary, this chapter reviewed risk management and contingency planning concept. The risk management process helps an organization understand the risks that it faces each day. It also helps organizations strengthen their security posture in response to threats and vulnerabilities. Many laws require organizations to use risk management concepts to create information security programs. Chapter also reviewed different types of contingency plans. An organization uses contingency plans to limit financial loss due to an adverse event. Contingency plans help minimize the length of time an organization's services and critical process are interrupted after an emergency. Thank you.